Hey everyone, welcome back. We are diving right into a situation that is really developing right now as we speak.
Yeah,
The incoming Trump administration's plans for immigration enforcement.
right.
It's January 2025. Things are moving very quickly. We have
Yeah.
news reports, official statements, reactions from communities all across the country.
Yeah.
Um,
It really is remarkable the speed at which things are escalating.
yeah,
And I think it really highlights just how urgent this situation is, how much tension there is around these issues.
right. And, at the heart of it, we have some really compelling figures.
Yeah.
We have, on the one hand, Tom Homan, who is I guess we could call him the border czar for the Trump administration, making some very bold statements about deportations beginning, immediately.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, we have advocates like Dulce Ortiz who are really, fighting hard to protect immigrant rights.
Well, and it's important to remember this was a major part of Trump's platform.
Yes.
The idea of mass deportations. And he seems to be wasting no time in making good on that promise. In fact, one of our sources has a quote from Trump where he says that deportations will begin very quickly.
Wow.
So, we're seeing that rhetoric really translating into action.
Yeah, and Homan seems to be really kind of leading the charge here.
He does.
There are reports that he attended a Republican gathering in Chicago
Okay.
and actually told the crowd there that deportations would start right here in Chicago, Illinois on January 21st.
Interesting. And that choice of location, I think, is very deliberate.
Yep.
Chicago, as a sanctuary city with a large undocumented population, really becomes a prime target, I think, for this administration's, enforcement efforts.
And let's talk about this term sanctuary city for a moment, because I think it's important to kind of unpack what that actually means in this context.
Sure. So essentially, sanctuary cities have policies in place that limit their cooperation with federal immigration authorities.
Okay.
The idea is to protect their immigrant communities from what they perceive as overly aggressive enforcement tactics by the federal government.
So it's a direct clash, right?
Absolutely.
Between the federal government asserting its authority to enforce immigration laws.
Yeah.
And then you have these cities kind of pushing back and saying, no, we're not going to be complicit in what we see as unjust policies, potentially harmful policies.
Exactly. And this clash is really, I think, at the heart of the current situation.
Yeah.
And Homan has been incredibly vocal about this.
Oh, yeah.
His disdain for these sanctuary cities. He argues that they pose a threat to public safety.
He's certainly not mincing his words. And there's one article where they quote him saying, ICE will take the handcuffs off and let them arrest criminal aliens.
Right. And I think that quote is incredibly revealing because it highlights Homan's hardline approach.
Yeah.
But it also raises this really crucial question
What is that?
about who exactly qualifies as a criminal alien.
Oh, right.
The administration claims to be targeting these dangerous individuals.
Right.
But the definition of criminal in this context can be quite broad.
Yeah.
It could include even minor offenses.
Wow.
So there's a lot of ambiguity there.
And then there's this whole other layer of complexity with the collateral arrests, right?
Precisely. So collateral arrests basically mean that even undocumented immigrants without criminal records could be swept up in these raids.
Oh, wow.
It's this ripple effect where anyone who happens to be present,
Wow.
regardless of their legal status or their criminal history,
Yeah.
they could be detained.
So you have Chicago, this major sanctuary city in the crosshairs,
Mm-hmm.
and, one of the sources indicates there were reportedly 200 ICE agents ready to hit the streets of Chicago on Monday at 5 a.m.
Think about the human impact of this.
Oh, yeah.
We have an article that shares the story of this 34-year-old woman in Chicago. She's a legal resident,
Okay.
but she's terrified for her undocumented family members.
Yeah.
This potential for families to be torn apart, is a very real and frightening consequence of this.
It sounds like an incredibly tense situation.
Yeah.
And to make matters even more complicated, there have been leaks about these planned raids.
Right.
So how has that kind of impacted the situation?
The leaks have been significant. They've actually forced the administration to kind of reconsider their plans, at least for the time being. And multiple articles mention that Homan himself expressed concern about officer safety due to these leaks.
So Homan is concerned about leaks.
Right.
But isn't that interesting? Because, he has a history of criticizing officials who leak information
He does.
about immigration raids,
Yeah.
claiming that it, jeopardizes operations. puts officers at risk.
It's quite ironic, isn't it?
Yes.
He's now facing the very challenges that he condemned others for creating.
Right.
And it's a testament, I think, to just how complex and how unpredictable this whole situation is.
It's like they're trying to play this high-stakes game.
Yeah.
But the rules keep changing, and nobody's really sure what the next move is going to be.
And all of this is unfolding, against a backdrop of fear and uncertainty within immigrant communities themselves.
What are you seeing in the sources about how people are reacting to this?
People are staying home, avoiding public places. There are rumors swirling on social media.
It's like a perfect recipe for anxiety and chaos.
Absolutely.
But amidst all this fear,
right,
I imagine there's also a sense of defiance.
Absolutely. Communities are rallying. They're holding Know Your Rights workshops. They're preparing to support each other in any way they can.
It's really inspiring to see that even when faced with such a daunting situation, that there's this determination to push back and to protect their own.
And it really speaks to, this idea of self-deportation that Homan advocates for.
Okay.
Being met with this act of resistance and a determination to stay and fight for their right to be here.
Yeah.
So it's really a fascinating dynamic.
Absolutely. So much to unpack here. And I think it's worth really taking a deeper look at what this self-deportation strategy actually entails.
Yeah.
And how it plays into this larger picture.
I agree.
So let's get into that right after this break.
This idea of self-deportation, I think, is a particularly chilling aspect of this administration's approach.
So let's break that down a little bit. What exactly does that mean? What does self-deportation look like in practice?
Well, it's about creating an environment that is so hostile, so unwelcoming, that immigrants feel they have no choice but to leave on their own.
Wow.
It's about making everyday life increasingly difficult, hoping to push people to a point where they just give up and go.
It sounds almost Orwellian. This idea of forcing people out, not through direct deportation, but through this campaign of pressure and fear.
It does have this kind of dystopian feel to it.
Yeah.
And it's a tactic that, we've seen employed throughout history to target marginalized groups, to make them feel unwelcome, unwanted. And it's not just about enacting harsh policies.
Right.
It's about cultivating this culture of fear and intolerance.
So how does this play out on the ground?
Well, we're seeing it in a number of ways. As we mentioned, the administration is taking the handcuffs off IC. They're removing some of the restrictions that were in place during the previous administration.
Yeah.
And they're giving ICE agents more latitude to, make arrests and deport people.
So it's not just about these high-profile raids.
Right.
It's about creating a system where deportation becomes more routine, more commonplace.
Exactly. And this has this chilling effect on immigrant communities.
Right.
Even if you haven't committed a crime, even if you've been living here peacefully for years, you suddenly find yourself looking over your shoulder, wondering if you're next.
So it creates this pervasive sense of fear and insecurity, which in itself becomes a form of control.
Absolutely. It sends this clear message, you're not welcome here.
Wow.
You're living on borrowed time.
And that message is amplified, I think, by certain media outlets that perpetuate harmful stereotypes and often dehumanizing rhetoric around immigrants.
It's crucial to be aware of that kind of framing, to really critically evaluate the information that we consume.
Right.
Because language has power. It shapes our perception, our attitudes, and ultimately our actions.
Yeah, we can't just passively absorb whatever we hear or read. We have to be discerning. We have to question assumptions. We have to seek out multiple perspectives.
Absolutely.
Especially in a situation like this where emotions are running high.
Yeah.
The stakes are so incredibly significant. We need to approach this issue with both our hearts and our minds.
Compassion and critical thinking, a powerful combination.
Yeah.
And it's essential if we want to move beyond the fear and the division that so often surrounds this immigration debate.
We need to find a way to have a productive conversation, one that acknowledges the complexity of this issue, recognizes the humanity of everyone involved.
It's not about choosing sides. It's about finding common ground, understanding each other's perspectives, working together to create a more just and equitable system.
It's a goal worth striving for, even if it feels incredibly challenging at times.
It is.
So where do we go from here? What happens next in this standoff between the Trump administration and these sanctuary cities?
It's difficult to say for sure, but one thing is certain, this issue isn't going away anytime soon.
Right.
This is likely to be, a defining battle in the fight for immigrant rights.
And the outcome of this is going to have far-reaching consequences, not just for the immigrants themselves, but I think for the very fabric of our society.
It's a moment that demands our attention, our engagement, our willingness to stand up for what we believe in.
Right.
It's a time to be informed, to be compassionate, and to be courageous.
Because the choices we make now are going to shape the future that we create.
Absolutely. And we have a responsibility, I think, to make those choices wisely, with both our hearts and our minds guiding us.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
Right.
We talked about the Trump administration's plans for mass deportations,
right,
the role of Tom Homan, this clash between federal and local authorities, the impact on immigrant communities, the importance of, critical thinking in a time of heightened emotions.
It's a complex and evolving situation.
Yeah.
It's important to stay informed and engaged.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, I want to bring it back down to the individual level for a moment.
Okay.
Because we're talking about policies and statistics and all these things.
Right.
But I'm thinking about the people who are directly affected by this.
Yeah.
The immigrants who are living in fear, the families that are being torn apart.
Absolutely.
It's so important for us to hear their stories, to understand the human cost of these policies.
You're right. Behind the statistics, behind the political rhetoric, there are real people with real lives, real hopes, and real dreams.
Yeah.
And their stories deserve to be heard. They have the power to change hearts and minds.
Because when we see the human face of immigration, when we connect with people on a personal level, it becomes much harder to demonize them, to see them as the other.
It reminds us that we're all connected, that we're all part of the same human family.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture, the political and social forces at play.
Right.
But now I think it's time to kind of shift our focus to what's happening on the ground in Chicago.
Okay. Chicago is really finding itself on the front lines of this battle.
Yeah.
Those 200 ICE agents we talked about earlier? It seems like their deployment has been delayed due to the leaks.
Okay.
But, the city is still bracing for impact.
So even with the leaks, even with the pushback, the threat is still very real.
Absolutely.
So what's the mood like in Chicago right now?
Well, there's a palpable sense of fear and anxiety.
Yeah.
But also this strong undercurrent of resilience. Community organizations are mobilizing.
Yeah.
They're providing know your rights training, setting up legal defense funds, creating these safe spaces for undocumented immigrants.
It sounds like a city preparing for a siege.
In a way it is. Mayor Brandon Johnson has vowed to protect immigrant communities and to resist this federal government crackdown.
But can a city actually defy federal law? Like, how much power do sanctuary cities actually have?
It's a complex legal question.
Yeah.
Sanctuary cities argue they're not breaking any laws. They're simply choosing not to use their limited resources to enforce federal immigration policies that they believe are unjust.
So it's a bit of a legal gray area, a battle of interpretations and jurisdictions.
Exactly. And it's a battle that's likely to play out in the courts for years to come.
As I'm listening to all this, I can't help but feel a sense of deja vu. Like, haven't we been down this road before?
It's true. These debates, anxieties flared up during previous administrations.
Right.
But what's really striking about this moment is the sheer scale and intensity of the Trump administration's approach.
It's like they're not just targeting individuals. They're trying to create this hostile environment for entire communities.
Exactly. And that's why this story is so important.
Yeah.
It's not just about immigration policy.
Right.
It's about the kind of society we want to be, the values we want to uphold.
So let's bring it back to our listener for a moment.
Okay.
Why should they care about what's happening in Chicago, what's happening with immigration policy in America?
Well, this situation, I think, underscores that politics isn't just some abstract game played out in Washington.
Yeah.
It has real-world consequences.
Right. Yeah.
It shapes the lives of individuals and communities across the country.
Even if you're not directly affected by these policies,
yeah,
we're all part of this larger social fabric.
We are.
What happens to one group of people ultimately affects us all.
Absolutely. And beyond that, this situation raises these really fundamental questions about justice, about fairness, about the role of government in our lives.
Those are questions that every citizen should be grappling with.
They are. It's a call to action, to stay informed, to engage in thoughtful dialogue, to use your voice, to advocate for the kind of society you want to live in.
We can't afford to be complacent or indifferent when so much is at stake.
No, we can't.
As we wrap up this deep dive,
yeah,
I'm left with this sense of urgency, but also a sense of hope.
I agree.
Even in the face of these immense challenges, we're seeing people and organizations fighting tirelessly to protect immigrant rights.
Yes.
To build a more just and welcoming society.
That's something worth fighting for.
It is.
It's a fight that requires courage and compassion and a commitment to creating a better future for everyone.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
We'll continue to follow the story as it unfolds.
Of course.
But for now, we hope this has given you a deeper understanding of the complexities and the human stories at the heart of this issue.